Today we have with us Dr. Glenn Geher, and he's from SUNY New Paltz in Evolutionary Psychology. And Dr. Geher is a colleague of our own Nate Pipitone, who's a new faculty member in psychology, and he's going to give his introduction. So,
thanks for coming, everybody, to this week's seminar series. I just want to pull up some stuff about Glenn. Interactive introduction. Where are you, Glenn? Awesome. So, again, so great to have Glenn Geher here in the crowd. He's a longtime friend and colleague of mine in the field of evolutionary psychology. So, Glenn's currently on sabbatical in the state of Florida, so traveling around, doing some talks, and teaching at Florida Atlantic University. He's a man that does so many different things. So I was lucky to kind of finagle him and kind of corral him into FGCU to get this talk today. So definitely happy to have him here. And I'm just going to mention a couple of things from Glenn's academic career. He's done a lot of stuff, but to kind of summarize some of his, who is Glenn in the academic sense. He's a full professor and was the psychology department chair at SUNY New Paltz for 8 years. He is the founding director of the Evolutionary Studies program at New Paltz, which is a National Science Foundation grant-funded program that is a cross-disciplinary approach to studying evolution. So students take classes and they learn from different professors and they learn about evolution through different lenses. So it's a really interesting program. And learning about evolution actually helps individuals do better in their own classes. So Glenn founded that at his institution. It's really awesome. He's also the founding president of Northeastern Evolutionary Psychology Society, NEEPS. And this is a great conference focusing on the impact of evolution on human behavior up in the northeast part of the U.S. And it's on its 10th or 11th year? 12th year, yeah. So that's a great conference that I've been to a couple times. Glenn's research does focus on human emotional intelligence, mating intelligence, and mating strategies in general, focusing on humans. He has over 100 peer-reviewed publications, including 6 books here. He's got a book on mating intelligence, measuring emotional intelligence here. He's got an Evolutionary Psychology 101 textbook, which is really cool. He's even dabbled in statistics. He's got a statistics textbook as well. So he's also a regular contributor to Psychology Today's website, this blog that he does. And so he does bi-weekly or maybe monthly blogs for Psychology Today, and it's titled "Darwin's Subterranean World." Really cool. Talking about, letting the public know about, how evolution works. I think that's one of the key issues that we have in this investigation of evolution. So, he's done, so many other things, but without a doubt, he's definitely at the forefront for teaching individuals and studying the impact of evolution. The list doesn't stop there, but he's also running for county legislator in Ulster County. I mean, he's training for a marathon. I mean, so the guy doesn't stop, right? So he's the master of all trades, definitely. So without further ado, please welcome Glenn Geher to FGCU.
All right, thank you everyone so much for coming. I just got to say that this particular piece I wrote yesterday, we just had an article about the Neanderthal quotient. Turns out that people think the Neanderthals are extinct. Not true. They hybridized with anatomically modern humans in multiple locations in Europe and Asia thousands and thousands of years ago. There's very strong evidence of that. And in fact, you can, through personal genome technology, they can document how much overlap individuals have with Neanderthals. And we found out in this study that the amount of Neanderthal-ness that someone has in his or her genome is actually significantly predictive of various personality attributes. And so it just came out in Human Ethology Bulletin, and I wrote the Psychology Today blog about it. Just today, on the drive here, a woman from Newsweek called me, and she's going to post an article about that on the web later today. Anyways, how Neanderthal are you? So before I get into my talk, which is on the topic of positive evolutionary psychology, I just want to tell you a little bit about our friend Nate Dipitone over here. I'm trying to think if this is the first time that I met him, or one of the first times that I met Nate. It's just kind of an interesting story, and I just feel obliged to tell you about it. He comes from a very storied research lab in evolutionary psychology at the University at Albany, the Gordon Gallup Evolutionary Psychology Lab, which has produced dozens of PhDs across the years, teaching all across the country, hundreds of research publications, just like a really awesome, famous research lab. And one day, about 10 years ago, Gordon Gallup invited me and my graduate students, we were rinky-dink compared to these guys, up to Albany to have a joint lab meeting. I'm like, well, that sounds fun. So we got in the cars, and we went up to Albany, and Gordon Gallup, long story as to why he's very interested in this, he became very interested in studying hand grip strength, which he calls a ubiquitous fitness indicator. So at the very beginning of the meeting, Gordon calls me up and he says, Glenn, I want you to squeeze this thing. And it was a dynamometer, is that what it was called?
Dynamometer, yeah.
And so I gave it my best. I didn't really expect this to be the beginning of the meeting. I gave it my best. He looked at it and he said, 60, not bad. And then he does this. He says, Nate. And he calls up Nate. I just wanted you to know that Nate got, I believe, a 64, if I recall correctly. Anyways, that's what you're dealing with right there. So I have a long history with Nate. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you to Dr. Frost so much for inviting me. And thanks for being here. So, the advent of positive evolutionary psychology. Let's see if I can put this out. Like that should work. So I've been teaching psychology for a very long time, and I have a particular interest in what's called evolutionary psychology. In short, evolutionary psychology is an approach to understanding human behavioral processes and psychological processes using Darwin's ideas as a guide, using the ideas in particular of natural selection and adaptation as a guide to help us understand why are the basic behavioral processes that we see in humans and in other species as they are. Can we use Darwin's insights to help us understand why behaviors have evolved as they have? So that's the basic idea of evolutionary psychology, and I'm totally into it, as I think Nate's introduction pointed out. Like, I can't get enough of it. And I'll tell you that over the years, I've developed a strong interest in advancing evolutionary psychology, not just in terms of advancing specific research agendas, but sort of in terms of the placement of it within academia, within the public sphere. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that. So I'll tell you, so this was an interesting time for me to do a sabbatical in Florida, and I chose Florida because my mom lives in Jupiter, and I wanted to spend some time with my mom. So I found myself driving down. This isn't exactly me. And I was driving down like right when Irma's coming. And so, you know, all my friends are like, so Glenn, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I'm driving to Florida. You know, and everyone's like, no, that's a really bad idea. So I survived. You know, my friend John Kraft posted this up on Facebook. It was a joke. Everything was fine. I'm glad that the state ended up being fine. What was interesting to me was on the drive down, all I heard was it was going to hit southwest. Southwest, I understand it did. But 95 is the northeast, right? It's the northeast. And when I hit the Florida line, like the northeasternmost part of the state, it was decimated and stuff was knocked down everywhere. I'm like, oh my God. So it was pretty eye-opening. But anyways, that was my trip. I made it, and I've been there. So I've been here for several weeks. I've been really fortunate to be able to have a one-credit brief teaching position at Florida Atlantic University at their Honors College in Jupiter, and I've been having just a great time of it. So let me tell you a little bit about this idea of positive evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology has something of a PR or public relations problem, and I've written about this in something that I'm calling Evolutionary Psychology 2.0. Kind of relates to this idea of positive evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is broad. It deals with any and all aspects of human behavior, but it's been particularly prominent regarding some topics that are highly evolutionarily relevant. Male-female differences in human mating behaviors has been a very famous area of inquiry, for instance, in evolutionary psychology. Some people don't really like that research. Infanticide, from an evolutionary perspective, is something that's been pretty highly publicized. Some people don't really like thinking about that. And so I think there's been a little bit of a concern that evolutionary psychology is kind of, partly because of a lot of the content that's been highly publicized, there's some people that don't really like it, and I love it so much, and I think it's so important that I'm really kind of, as hard as I can in my career, working to sort of get people to see the bright side of evolutionary psychology. So that's really largely the idea of positive evolutionary psychology. From an evolutionary perspective, evolution has so many insights to add to so many positive aspects of the human experience. Why be nice to other people? Evolutionary psychologists have studied this kind of question extensively. Why work toward the greater good? As Nate said, I'm running for office right now, and the way that I think about things, maybe I'm being naive, but I really think that elected officials need to be people that are primarily working toward the greater good. How can we use an evolutionary perspective to understand what that even means? Why should we be altruistic, right? You have only so much time on this planet. You have only so many resources in terms of fiscal resources, time-related resources, energy. Why would you spend your time helping others at a cost to oneself? Well, evolutionary psychologists have studied this stuff inside and out for decades. So if you want to understand these positive aspects of the human experience, we really need to focus on and understand and appreciate the evolutionary perspective. Positive evolutionary psychology is essentially the idea of using the powerful framework of evolutionary psychology to build a better world. So at about the same time that evolutionary psychology grew as a discipline, there's another discipline that sort of emerged, I'd say similar in scope and similar in size, called positive psychology. Positive psychology started famously with one speech by one man in 1990, and that man was Martin Seligman. Seligman's a very famous behavioral scientist. His publications go back deep into the 60s, and he became the president of the American Psychological Association. In his inaugural address, he said, "We need to change psychology." That psychology is so famous for focusing on pathology, mental health disorders, problems. And frankly, those things are not going away, and those are things that we do need to understand. But why don't we step back and take a look at all the things that human beings are doing right and are doing well, and why don't we build an entire scientific discipline wrapped around understanding the positive aspects of the human psychological experience and how we can cultivate those kinds of things. It was such a groundbreaking idea at the time that it led to a large-scale academic field, now with graduate programs, journals, textbooks, and the like, and it was really a great idea. The problem with the idea, and I don't think it was a problem with the idea, but the problem with the implementation of the idea, is that when you look at the work of positive psychologists, it is, I'd say, completely devoid of any evolutionary framework. And as an evolutionary psychologist, I'm looking at the field of positive psychology, and I feel like I'm shouting. I'm like, oh my goodness, do you know how much better you can understand these things you're studying if you use an evolutionary framework? So that's the basic idea of this topic. So I got so excited about this idea that I wrote up a book proposal. I had a student at the time, Nicole Wedberg, who's now an alum. She just got married in Albany this past weekend. Really nice wedding. I said, Nicole, how would you like to do this book together on this topic? She's an award-winning writer herself. As a student, she won multiple writing awards. She's a really bright person to work with. And so we said, let's do it. We submitted the proposal to Oxford University Press. They quickly actually gave it a thumbs up. Not usually how it works when you submit a book proposal. So it gave us the feeling we were on to something. And so we just submitted it. Actually, on my drive down before I was in Savannah, I was in Richmond, which is where Nicole's living these days, and we submitted this book to the publisher, and it's in their hands. So it's Positive Evolutionary Psychology, Darwin's Guide to Living a Richer Life. And there's Nicole right there. That's the day she finished her master's thesis. You can tell she's smiling because she passed her master's thesis. And that's our friend Greta, who was on her committee as well. And Gordon Gallup was actually on her committee by So I'd like to walk you a little bit through what this book looks like to give you sort of a bigger picture, a bird's eye view of the way that we're conceptualizing this particular field. The first chapter, which I actually have linked to my website if anyone's interested in that, it's in kind of draft like Microsoft Word form, is the introduction, like what is evolutionary psychology, what is positive psychology, how can we even think about these things as integrating with one another. Second chapter has to do with what we call evolutionary mismatch. So if you've taken a class in evolutionary psychology, you're probably aware of evolutionary mismatch. It's a very foundational idea, and if not, I'll give you the 30-second version. Any species evolved under specific conditions over long periods of time. The typical conditions, the conditions that were typical during the ancestral past of that species, we call the EEA, or the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. For humans, we're talking about the African savanna for thousands and thousands and thousands of generations. Humans didn't leave Africa until about 100,000 years ago, which is a slice of the human evolutionary story. What are some other features of those ancestral conditions? People had small groups. They didn't live in large groups. They didn't encounter strangers very often. They didn't encounter McDonald's. They didn't encounter food that was evolutionarily unnatural. They didn't encounter couches and cable TVs, so they didn't have the option of sitting around doing no exercise all day. They did not have cell phones, which are now considered as addictive as heroin, and more than 50% of teenagers today report that they are addicted to cell phones, and the other ones are lying, right? So there are so many ways that things are mismatched. And when you have a mismatch, you can have problems. Florida sea turtles actually are usually given as a great example of evolutionary mismatch. For eons, sea turtles had a very simple behavioral rule. When they hatch, and they hatch at night, and it's based on temperature, temperature regulated processes, they come out of their little shells and they go toward, they have what's called a phototaxic response. They go toward the light. And that algorithm worked for a very, very long time. Now, if it's night and you're in Florida and you come out of your little shell, the light might be where? It might be across Route 95, right? It might be on the other side. It might be across. It might be in Fort Lauderdale. It might be in Miami. So that's one of the, when they talk about there's a real crisis with sea turtles, that's one of the major problems that they need to address. Their phototaxic response, it usually means it used to mean go to the ocean where there was the light of the moon and the stars, and now there's a mismatch. Human beings have tons of mismatched conditions that we run into now. And to understand the problems of the human experience today, evolutionary mismatch is a very basic idea that can shed light on lots of different aspects of problems that we experience and can give insights into how to overcome those problems and live a healthier life. Chapter number 3 is about what we call the democratic age. There's several different ways that we can understand humans as evolved for democracy or as evolved for egalitarianism. And there's a particular theory that we underscore in there by Paul Bingham and Joanne Souza, which it takes two simple ideas. They have a whole book, it's about 800 pages, it's called Death from a Distance. And the two basic ideas in their theory, one, human beings clearly evolved for elite throwing. So if you ever see a non-human primate throw rocks or sticks at a predator, they're very bad at it. Human beings are amazing at projectiles, are amazing at throwing. And the human body evolved for that. There's a lot of research showing that the evolution of the muscular system and the skeletal system in the human body evolved for that. At about the same time, human beings evolved the ability, and this is something the Neanderthals never evolved, by the way. Homo sapiens evolved the ability to coordinate socially with others across kin lines. So we can have like 5 or 6 of us, even if we're not genetically related to each other, say, hey, you know what, here's an idea, why don't we all do this together? That had the capacity, those two things in combination, allowed our ancestors the opportunity to succeed even if you were not the dominant or the alpha individual in a group. right? So it didn't matter if there's someone bigger, meaner, and more muscular. If you have 5 of you and you're kind of small and nerdy, but you're smart and you have rocks and you can throw them, you really have an awful lot of power. So that's, and there's a lot of really interesting research showing, based on those simple ideas, we're in a democratic state. And that has a lot of implications for getting along in communities. The bright side of religion, evolutionary reasoning is famous for being at odds with religion. People like Richard Dawkins, I think Richard Dawkins is an incredibly important scholar, by the way, but he's isolated a lot of religious people in a lot of his writings. Regardless of issues of origin, which is really, as far as I can tell, the only place that there's an argument there, everywhere else, there doesn't necessarily need to be an argument. There's a lot of other issues at hand. Religion can be studied from an evolutionary perspective. And in fact, there's a lot of great scholars who have studied religion from an evolutionary perspective. For instance, David Wilson at Binghamton he wrote Darwin's Cathedral, and he studied religions all across the world. And what are the basic features of religions all across the world? What you tend to find is, no matter how different they look on the surfaces, religions have very common themes. Religions seem to have an ultimate function of cultivating other-oriented behavior, getting people to motivated to help out others at a cost to oneself. That's a theme that exists in religion after religion after religion. There's no religions documented where they're trying to encourage selfish behavior. So that gives you some insights into the evolutionary origins of religion. Religion's so common and so basic and so well documented as a species-typical characteristic that we need to understand it as opposed to sort of dismiss it as evolutionists. Chapter 5, happiness, gratitude, and love. These are 3 really common things that are studied from positive psychologists. And I got to tell you, when I read stuff that's written by positive psychologists on happiness, there's a major problem that is very consistent in that research. There's tons of research in positive psychology that's about how can we make people happy, as if happiness is kind of the end goal of life. From an evolutionary perspective, happiness is just like any other evolved feature. It's something that probably evolved because it conferred survival and reproductive benefits to our ancestors. And from that perspective, fear, anxiety, and what we might consider the nasty emotions probably are just as evolutionarily relevant as is happiness. So let's just facilitate happiness approach to psychology, I think, is misguided and is missing sort of the bigger picture that the evolutionary perspective really provides. The same with under the study of gratitude, the same with the study of love. These are things that are studied extensively by evolutionary psychologists, but again, with this sort of bigger picture approach. Chapter 6, taking the high road to life. One thing that evolutionary psychologists focus on is the fact that there are multiple strategies to success. Any area of functioning in human behavior, especially human social behavior, usually has multiple paths. So you might have learned in some of your psychology classes about the dark triad. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the dark triad. So this is like a really big thing nowadays, and you'll see I measure it. It's a very powerful set of ideas that does predict behavior. The dark triad is kind of nasty. People that are high in the dark triad are psychopaths. They don't care about others. They're Machiavellians. They will use you and spit you out. And they're narcissists, and they focus much more on themselves than on others. Are people high in the dark triad successful? Without getting political, I'm not in New Paltz, so I don't know if I should get political or not, but I will say yes. We have lots of famous documented cases of highly successful people. It is a path to success, and in lots and lots of areas, being high in the dark triad is a path to leadership, success, and it doesn't necessarily have positive benefits for people sort of, down below or for the broader group. There's lots of other paths to success as well, and evolutionary psychologists who study this multiple strategy approach to behavior really have documented, okay, here's one evolutionarily successful behavioral approach, but here's an alternative that leads to the same outcome and that also leads to more positive outcomes for the broader community. So we might think of that as sort of taking the high road to life. An evolutionary psychology of resilience. There's going to be stressors in life. This is just the nature of life. That's true of any organism. I wrote a whole Psychology Today blog about dandelions. You get dandelions in Florida? No? Well, you know what they are.
Yeah.
So where I live, dandelions are unbelievable because I will mow my lawn and I will turn around and there they are again, right? They are so incredibly resilient. And that's just true of, species, any species that has really evolved to the point of success has various resilience processes built in. Human beings do too, and that's also been documented well from an evolutionary perspective. We have a chapter on healthy living. Mental health and physical health can be understood extensively from an evolutionary perspective. You might be aware of the paleo lifestyle or the paleo diet. I know sometimes that can get a little bit controversial, but the simple version of the paleo diet is that before agriculture, not a single human being ever ate any processed food. So for the first, 99% of human evolution, no one ever ate processed food. I have a student named Mandy Guitar. Mandy Guitar is finishing her PhD right now. She teaches a class at Binghamton in Darwinian medicine. She gave an amazing talk at my university recently. And here's a stat that she gave. 62% of all the food consumed in the United States by all of us in a year is processed food, stuff that never would have existed before agriculture. So if you go to a kid's birthday party, for instance, right? So I have 2 kids, and I've been to lots of birthday parties. My son's asking for a giant birthday party. He's 14, I'm not sure. Anyways, if you go to a kid's birthday party, there's a table with the cake, and next to the cake, it's usually mom puts out the grapes, right? And the apples. And at the end of the day, what's left on that table? Right? Grapes and apples, I mean, sweet fruits. Before the advent of agriculture, that was it. That was the best that you could do. And human beings evolved with that being the playing field. The second that processed foods made, once human beings had the technology, we can make what people like in this incredibly hyper, super stimulus kind of way. Suddenly, that's what we evolved to like. And we, so it's really not that difficult to do, but it has incredibly adverse health consequences. So the evolutionary perspective gives us lots of insights into what healthy living might look like. Building Darwin's community, evolutionary psychologists have a very large focus on the nature of community. Human beings have always been a communal species, and we can understand that from an evolutionary perspective. What, under ancestral conditions, what did communities look like? What were the features of those communities? In a lot of ways, you'll see they're similar to communities today, but in a lot of ways, they are consistently different. And our minds did not evolve to be surrounded by 50,000 people that you never met before, right? Or I live in a small town of 8,000. My university is a small university with 8,000. So we have 16,000 people in this small town, in a small school. There was not a single, before agriculture, when all human beings for the history of humans were nomads, there was not a single person that ever encountered any number of people even close to that. So that's another major mismatch. So understanding human communities needs to take into account human evolution. And then finally, I have what I call Darwin's quick tips for living a richer life. This is the final chapter. It's a little bit self-helpy, stepping outside my comfort zone a little bit on that one. And these are some of the, in that particular chapter, this particular chapter, here's implications for physical health that you can take away, consider what the body was selected to experience. Mental health, turn off your cell phone and call your mom. Human beings were not designed or not shaped or not evolved to have their extended kin all over the place, right? But especially if you live in Florida, Florida has so many transplants with relatives in New York, and my brother lives in LA. My other brother lives in Jersey, and he's my close brother because I see him once every 3 months. I mean, this is not how human beings evolve. So we need to think about natural conditions and what humans evolve to be like when we're thinking about issues related to mental health. Social relationships, you'll see from some of the research I'm going to describe in just a little bit, we evolved to forgive, apologize, and stay connected. we sort of cut people off or cut people out or engage in nasty behaviors to our own detriment in many cases, and that's part of the human evolutionary story. Parenting, if you look at what parenting regularly looks like, especially in pre-Westernized societies, you're constantly teaching kids don't be selfish. Think about others. I like to think of it as work toward the greater good. That's what parenting is like, right? So like when you see the one kid takes the slice of pizza from the other kid, right? Well, that was selfish. You got to share. Cultivating an attitude about sharing. That's a very basic aspect of what we evolved to be like in terms of parenting. Community, we're communal aid, and we need to understand what that means. And we have a whole section in there about sort of, what's kind of the goal of life. I actually gave a talk at this at Florida Atlantic yesterday, and there was a professor there who asked, well, from this perspective, what is the goal of life? What is the purpose? Because positive psychologists are very big into the purpose. And of course, that question is obviously beyond me in a lot of ways. But for my money, one thing that we can do that's deeply rooted in our evolutionary origins is cultivating positive community, because if you can do that, communities and the effects on community will outlast money or anything, material kinds of things. Religion and spirituality. Religion has the ultimate function of shaping behavior to be other-oriented. So this is sort of the David Wilson view of the evolution of religion. He talks about he talks about two axes of religion. The horizontal dimension, the ultimate function of religion is to have people want to help others and want to sacrifice themselves. And that's a basic thing you see in religion after religion. What he calls the vertical dimension of religion is something related to the supernatural. It could be God or a series of gods or something else that sort of is inexplicable, and those mechanisms seem to serve the function of cultivating the other-oriented approach. That is really sort of the ultimate function of religion. So understanding these things probably can help people in their daily lives. So that's kind of a summary of the book. So I've got two studies that I'll be talking about. These come from the Evolutionary Psychology Lab. And the first one, these are both about the importance of staying connected to others. So when we think about the evolution of staying connected to others, the evolutionary psychological perspective, I think, has just very strong implications for understanding this particular topic. So this study is called You're Dead to Me, the Evolutionary Psychology of Estrangement. A lot of this relates to something we call Dunbar's number. Robin Dunbar is a cognitive evolutionary psychologist at Oxford University. He's very focused on how the mind processes people, so social cognitive processing. And he essentially came up with a bunch of studies to show that we're really designed to not interact with more than 150 people in our lifetime. If you look at nomadic groups, or you look at the size of ancestral groups, nomadic groups had to be capped. They had to be small. You couldn't have 16,000 people in a nomadic group because you got to move them all in 3 weeks because you just moved over there, and there's logistical constraints. The human mind evolved for small-scale living, and these small-scale groups included kin. So you had a high proportion of your kin that you were surrounded by regularly. That's what the human mind evolved to anticipate, and long-standing community members. Someone that you were going to see tomorrow and the next day and the next day until one of you died. And that's not what life is right now, right? Like right now, you have a new semester and you're surrounded by 95% of people you never met before. Yeah, that's not what the human mind evolved to be like. Under those conditions, social options were limited. So that has implications for understanding the nature of estrangements. Social estrangement exists when people cut ties from one another. So the classic examples are romantic breakup. My parents got divorced in about 1983. They were not in a room together again until 1997, right? So that's, so romantic breakup, that's a classic example of, never going to talk to you again kind of thing. Family fights is another instance, this person slighted this person, so they can't be in the same room together, and you shouldn't talk to that person kind of thing. Intersexual rivals, if there's individuals that are competing for status or for a particular partner or particular mate, there might be fighting to the point that they become estranged and so So there's a lot of conditions nowadays where you might have someone that is just, in quotes, dead to you. From an evolutionary mismatch perspective, we can think a little bit about estrangements. Our minds didn't evolve in such conditions where we have such very large pools of people like we do now. So estrangements from this perspective are predicted to hurt, perhaps more so than makes sense in modern conditions. Under ancestral conditions, an estrangement would have had devastating consequences. If there was only 150 people and suddenly you had a tantrum and you cut 5 or 6 of them out, you might have been in for some trouble moving forward. So the primary prediction here is that the number of estrangements someone has should be predictive of poor mental health outcomes. The number of estrangements should predict depressive tendencies. Each facet of the dark triad should predict the number of estrangements. Maybe estrangements for someone with a dark triad approach to life, maybe that's kind of an outcome of that particular approach. You look at the relationship between number of estrangements and depressive tendencies as potentially being mediated by, I'll walk you through the statistical mediation concept soon, concept of life history strategy. In evolutionary psychology, life history strategy is the idea that some people take a slow approach to life, assuming that you're going to have a long life, assuming you're going to have stable conditions. These people might get married later, they might have fewer offspring, they might invest more in particular offspring, versus people that might have a fast approach to life, who behave in their life as if life is short, and there are unpredictable conditions, and you might want to have multiple partners and multiple offspring because you never know what's going to happen. So there's a measure of life history strategy that we included. There's a measure of anxious attachment style, so in the way that we're attached to other people, especially in romantic relationships. Some people are really anxious, and measures here are like an item is like you regularly ask the person, do you still love me? Do you still love me? Like this kind of question would be like, are you anxious about that relationship? We also measured emotional stability and other of the big 5 personality traits. We gave a measure of social support, thinking that would relate to how people deal with estrangements and the effects of estrangements. And we measured the dark triad. And this was the basic methodology. So we had 315 adults complete the survey. Estrangement was clearly defined, so the first thing we did is we explained, here's what an estrangement is. It's when you had a relationship with someone, and then based on a mutual agreement, you are cut off from one another with an agreement that you're not going to interact with one another again. And then we had them complete measures of all these dimensions that I was talking about. That's kind of shaky. I'm just, I don't know if there's much we can do. It actually makes it more interesting. Animation. So this is a frequency histogram, and it's funny, I keep wanting to do this, but that's not good. So here's a frequency histogram of the data, actually. So the mean is 3.86. This is the number of estrangements someone has in his or her life. So how many people are dead to you in your life now? And the average is 4. There's about 18 people or so that have 0. This kind of seems normally distributed here, but then we have this interesting thing where there's a spike at 10, and then there's someone, I think this was 28 or something over here. So there's variability, right? If you've taken stats and if you love stats, which is one and the same, you can see that there's high variability for this particular dimension, and that this is a skewed distribution, right? This is what we call positively skewed. Yeah.
When you're saying like you're dead to me, is that saying were you testing like, okay, we don't talk anymore, or like I have anger towards you and I don't talk?
The way we defined it, I'd say would encapsulate both of those. It's when there's a person in your life who you had a relationship with, and I think there is an anger component. I forget exactly how to word it, but it's like that person is so like out of your life, and you will never talk to them. You never will plan to talk to that person. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be sensible to normalize the size of your social network? So, for instance, if you're very gregarious, right, and 1,000 people and you're estranged from 10, that's less degree of estrangement than if you, let's say, know 5 people and you're estranged from 3 of them, right? So there could be some sort of proportionality
That's a
issue.
great, we had, that's a brilliant concept. We hadn't even thought about that.
Normalized by social network size.
Yeah. I don't think we have the data or a proxy for that. now that
Yeah,
I
it's
think
hard to
about it.
say.
But that could be a really good future, that could be a really good future research.
Yeah.
So this is the nature of the distribution. Now, the first thing we did, and you'll see for statistical reasons, this wasn't a perfect way to analyze the data, but it was the most obvious way to analyze the data. First thing we did was zero-order correlations between the number of estrangements people had and all these other variables that we were talking about. You can see there are some statistically significant correlations. The ones that are statistically significant pretty much are in the directions that we predicted. So estrangements are positively correlated with being Machiavellian, being psychopathic, being narcissistic. So people high in the dark triad are more likely to have estrangements, or a higher number of estrangements. People that are emotionally stable are likely to have fewer estrangements. So there does seem to be a connection with emotional stability. Sociosexuality, or tendency toward promiscuity, essentially, was positively related, or at least behavior, promiscuous behavior, was related to the number of estrangements, which someone in Miami, actually, I gave a talk there on this, and someone pointed out that might be part of sort of a generally dismissive approach to life. Like, I don't really care much about other people as long-term social partners, and so that would sort of explain that. Perceived social support was not significant here, but you'll see that change in our upcoming analysis. People that were anxious in their attachment style had more estrangements. People that were fast in their life history strategy had more estrangements, so that was, again, consistent with our prediction. And number of estrangements was predictive of depressive tendencies. So this was basically consistent with our predictions. There were small effects, and me and my student Vanya, I had this great graduate student Vanya, recently graduated, but she and I were looking at this, and she said, well, why don't we poke around and think about this particular group, the extreme estrangers, and do some simple analyses just comparing the extreme estrangers with everybody else. So this was pretty straightforward from a statistical standpoint. We just computed between groups t-test between these two groups. And these analyses, by the way, I'm only presenting ones where there was a significant effect. And also, actually, I was working with one of my students at FAU, Stefan, and we computed a bunch of Cohen's D's. And while the effect sizes for the correlations were small, when we looked at things this way, some of the effect sizes were pretty big. So Cohen's D goes essentially from 0 on up. Anything above 0.5 starts approaching a large effect size. So red is the extreme estrangers, and what we see is the extreme estrangers are more Machiavellian, more psychopathic, more narcissistic, higher in the total dark triad, higher in having behaviors that are promiscuous, but also, when we look at it this way, they're more likely to have an attitude about sex that is more promiscuous, they're more likely to have desires, sociosexual desires that are more promiscuous and score higher total on that particular dimension. We also found effects for social support when we looked at it this way, the extreme estrangers versus everyone else. The extreme estrangers have less social support from their significant other, less social support from their family, less social support from their friends, less social support total. They're also lower in emotional stability, lower or higher in anxious attachment. They're more depressed, and when we look at it this way, there's a pretty big effect for life history strategy, with them being much more likely to score as fast in life history strategy. So when we looked at the extreme estrangers, it was kind of like the effects we were looking for were magnified. So there seems to be particular problems if you're very high on the number of estrangements. The number of estrangements seems to be like a real good predictor of this sort of battery of problems across a whole bunch of psychological features. So then we did what are called the mediation analyses. And this, again, I had this great graduate student, Vanya, and she just loves that so much. She hates this stuff up. She's like, Glenn, we need to do a mediation analysis. I'm like, Vanya, that's all you, young lady. So she did. And And so the basic idea here is when you do a mediation analysis, you have an X variable, in this case, number of estrangements, and a Y variable or an outcome variable, in this case, depressive tendencies. And then you can see if a bunch of other variables kind of in the middle explain why the X variable accounts for changes in that Y variable. So those are mediation or mediator variables. So the mediator variables we put in, and again, in between the X of number of estrangements and the Y of depressive tendencies, were essentially all these other variables. And here's what we find. Number of estrangements had a direct effect associated with depression, but that effect was particularly mediated through emotional stability. So if you had a lot of estrangements, that led to a significant drop in emotional stability, which seems to potentially have a causal role in depression. So if you're not emotionally stable, you might be depressed. And higher estrangements also seem to have a direct effect on anxious attachment, which seems to also have a direct effect on depression. So these are two mediational paths that came out, indirect mediational paths that came out as significant. So in other words, why and how is estrangement related to depressive tendencies? It seems particularly through these paths of emotional stability and anxious attachment. So the bottom line here, that the number of estrangements that someone had was positively related to depressive tendencies. People that were extreme, the extreme estrangers, were really troubled in various ways. And when you look at those findings, it was like across a whole bunch of unrelated areas of psychological functioning. Several variables seem to mediate this effect. I think social support was actually like a borderline significant, but emotional stability and attachment styles seem to play a mediational role. And these variables seem to, in turn, lead to depressive tendencies. So I had another graduate student, Rich Holler, nicest guy, and he graduated too. I miss my students. So Rich gave a presentation on this at a conference we held on campus, and I'll never forget, he said so genuinely, he said, when it comes to estrangements just don't do it. And there's a gratuitous picture of me and Rich at one of our graduation parties last year. And so that's the bottom line on the estrangement study. And again, using an evolutionary perspective, I think we really got a lot of insights into the importance of staying connected with others and the pitfalls of not staying connected with others or having estrangements. So how much?
There is a class here
At
at 4:30.
4:30. Okay. I'm going to give you guys, and quote me on this, I'm going to give you the 4-minute version of study 2. We can do that, right? We can do a 4-minute version of this. The working title, it's the working title, might not end up being the real title at the end of the day. Your rug doesn't match your color scheme, and no, I'm not sorry. So this particular study was an experimental methodology. So we used a different kind of methodology. Experimental methodology to figure out responses to social transgressions. So it's kind of a follow-up to the estrangement study. How much does, yeah?
Are these like minor things, are these like minor things, or are these like major things?
That's a great question. That was actually one of our main independent variables. Exactly that. So is it a big transgression or is it a small transgression? So that's one of the variables we were interested in studying. Was it a transgression targeted at your property, like your rug, or targeted at you as an individual? And was there an apology or not? We kind of predicted that a big transgression would lead to more negative social outcomes. Transgression that's ad hominem, or at the person, should also lead to more negative social implications, and an apology should probably help. So here's one of the stimuli. So we had 8 different conditions because we had those 3 independent variables, each with 2 levels. So we had 8 conditions. I'll just show you 2 of the conditions that are extreme to give you a sense. Your friend, this one, there is an apology. The transgression was at an object and it was minor. So your friend Victor and you were talking at a party that you were hosting. The doorbell rang, you excused yourself briefly. Just as you came back into the room, you overheard Victor say that your rug doesn't match your color scheme. Can you imagine that? You immediately catch Victor's eye at that moment, and Victor then says to you, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, I was out of line. So you have the apology. Apology, it's at your rug, and it's relatively this is, so we can call that nice Victor, this is nasty Victor. There's no apology, it's at you, ad hominem, and it's major. And so hopefully this, I'll be curious to see if you think this one counts as major. So your friend Victor and you were talking at a party, you were hosting, the doorbell rang, you excused yourself briefly. Just as you came back into the room, you overheard Victor say that he thinks you're such a joke and he just came for the pizza, right? You immediately catch Victor's eye at that moment and says, no offense, but it's true, right? So not much of an apology there. And by the way, the phrase no offense means I'm about to offend you. Right? A little life lesson right there. So those were we had 8 scenarios, those were 2 of the extreme scenarios. And then we just asked people on a 1 to 7 scale, how much would you forgive Victor? How angry would you be? How much would you stay friends? How betrayed would you feel? And we also measured the big 5 and the personality traits and the dark triad, so psychopathy, machiavellianism, and narcissism. And so I'll walk you through, these were some of the basic effects. Forgiving Victor. There was a Victor version, then there was a Lauren version as well. They happen to be the names of anthropologists down the hall from me. By chance. So this was pretty typical of what we found. Transgression intensity, this is a very big effect. There was a big main effect. If it was a major transgression, right, that one where he says you're such a joke, you were less likely to forgive Victor. Independent of that, if the transgression was at you, so it was about you being such a joke and not your carpet being such a joke, that also had a significant effect as well. So being at you made you less likely to forgive Victor. And the apology, and you'll see I have a whole bunch of data because that's how we do stuff. We're nerdy and we love our SPSS. But all these slides tell the same story. The apology had no effect. Transgression intensity had an effect. Transgression target had an effect. Some of them had a significant interaction effect. So whether you would stay friends with Victor showed a significant intensity by target interaction, which was a pretty big interaction. I'll show you the graph for that. This one also, by the way, for staying friends was the only one where there was almost a significant effect for the apology. So if you apologize or not, that might help you maintain the friendship, but you're still not going to be forgiven. You're going to be perceived as betraying that person. You'll be perceived as making that person angry. Maybe that person will stay friends. Here's the intensity by target interaction, what it looks like. Transgression target, 0. This is the one that's at your rug. And this is how much you would stay friends. You can see it was a 1 to 7 scale. Regardless of whether it was a small transgression or a big transgression, if it was at your rug, everyone's like, yeah, whatever, I'll stay friends with Victor. If it was at you, but it was minor, it was kind of like, well, I'll still stay friends with Victor. And this accounts for the significant interaction. If it was at you, that one where you're such a joke, and it was nasty, that's the one where you're like, all right, goodbye, Victor. You're not my friend anymore. So we can think about sort of the evolutionary psychology of when estrangements occur and why they occur. And this is essentially the kind of condition. All the interactions told that same story, essentially. And this is just kind of a summary of those same findings. Interactions had that common theme. In terms of the big 5 personality variables, agreeableness was positively related to forgiveness and negatively related to revenge. That was another variable we studied. How much would you want revenge on Victor? Right? He said that about my color scheme. I'm going to get him. And people that were high in neuroticism or low in emotional stability regularly felt angered and felt betrayed. And that cut across all the experimental conditions. The dark triad I thought was pretty interesting. And it's really, this is what the dark triad people think like. They want revenge. If they're high in Machiavellianism, they want revenge. If they're high in psychopathy, they want revenge. If they're high in narcissism, they want revenge. And they feel betrayed, and they're angry, and they're embarrassed. So this is the sort of this social psychology of the dark triad. Bottom line, transgression intensity matters, ad hominem attacks matter, and hold the apology. So I think that's right. There's a little life lesson right there. Don't mess up in the first place. Kind of hard to do sometimes. and the dark triad and the big five predicted outcomes, responses to transgressions, connected directions. So the evolutionary psychology and social connections bottom line, how this research fits in with the bigger research agenda. Both of these studies describe, shed light on the nature of social connections in humans using an evolutionary framework as a guide. Ethan McMahon, who teaches at Western Oregon University, where I taught decades ago, he's a really cool positive psychologist, and here's his definition. Positive psychology is the scientific study of optimal human feeling and functioning. So as I see it, understanding the factors that cause problems in our social connections or connections to others has clear implications for understanding human feelings and functioning. So positive psychologists can benefit from in terms of the future of positive evolutionary psychology, trying to understand the positive aspects of our psychological worlds without using an evolutionary framework is like trying to find a flashlight in a dark garage during a hurricane. But I got a little Florida there in my example. It started with basement, but then I changed it because, you know, right, there's no sleep in the basement. With all aspects of what it means to be human, applying evolutionary principles is essentially turning on the light when you are looking for something. So positive psychology ignores evolutionary principles to its own peril. So claps to this is my team of researchers that work with me in the Evolutionary Psych Lab. This was the kickball tournament. We have a research team kickball tournament every year. The face paint and everything, we still took 4th place. Don't ask, it was kind of a bad day, but this is the engine of all the research that I do. I had a great time with this kid Stefan at FAU, who helped me with some of these data presentation things. And if you ever get to meet Kevin Lanning at FAU, this guy is just a superstar and has really helped make for a great experience for me here in Florida. And thank you for listening. There's a friendly alligator. And so Laura, we got time for questions.
We have a little time for questions, but if students have to leave for classes or whatnot, or anybody who wants to get.
No one will be offended. Right. Exactly.
So
But yeah.
questions?
A question about trust.
Yeah.
Differences between whether or not there were any gender issues, male,
You know, it's a very good question. And I know I flew through those analyses. The way that I organized the data, and this is really for logistical purposes, for the stimuli, was whatever condition you were in for Victor, you got the same condition for Lauren. So we thought it would just be too complicated analytically to separate those out. And the patterns of results across participants for Victor and Lauren were similar. We haven't yet broken down things by gender of the observer. But what would you, is there something you would
the question
expect?
is whether or not you're more intended to the same gender.
Yeah, for intrasexual. Yeah, I think, you know what, just hearing you say that makes me think that's a really feasible hypothesis. And that's something that, like I said, we haven't submitted this yet, so we will definitely look at that. Yeah, thank you. We had over here, yeah.
So in study 1, you conceptualize the analysis, and your students' comment kind of gets at the same idea that the number of estrangements is causing all these negative outcomes. And I know you just measured it, so you didn't go that far to say it. But you could think about it the other way, right? If somebody's more neurotic or more Machiavellian, for example, why they're estranging more people.
Absolutely, yeah. So that, that mediation analysis was, even though it seemed probably kind of complicated if it was new to you, it was actually kind of simple because it didn't really take steps into account. And so I think we really need to do a fuller path analysis to sort of see if there are bi-directional components, because I think you're exactly right. I think a lot of those arrows could have gone in both directions, and we need to flesh that out better.
The other sort of physical sort of evolutionary point is that you don't really separate romantic estrangements from other sorts of estrangements, right? And you can imagine a lot of the evolutionary reasons why. You can imagine these individuals, right, who may actually be have high degrees of estrangement in romantic contexts, but in a non-romantic sort of just friends, professional context, have zero estrangements, right? And so those might be looking at. I guess what I'm saying is you might have two different types of psychological processes going on under the same heading. The intention is to break those up and piece them apart and see to what extent the variability, to what extent your data is being accounted for by romantic estrangement data versus other sorts of estrangement.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'll tell you that if I showed you the SPSS data file, I think everyone would just like falling down. Like it was the most complicated SPSS file. And the reason being, because for each estrangement, in fact, person who they were thinking about, so they would, for the subsequent questions, have that person in their mind. And then we asked a lot of very detailed questions. In fact, a lot of it was even open-ended. So it was like, who was this person to you? Who initiated the estrangement? I think we might have had about 7 or 8 parameters per estrangement. So like that person who had like 27 had like, I guess like 7 times 27, like, you know, columns and columns and columns. So this, you know, our initial analyses, we kind of found that just the total number of estrangements ended up behaving statistically in like the most ubiquitous kind of way. And when we looked at it from these other, we didn't find effects of kind of estrangement in our initial analysis, which is why we look at it now.
Okay.
You know, we have ideas, we might try and go back and look at that more nuanced, but our efforts to do that so far have not turned up anything that we would have.
You also then asked how long how long the relationship was that part of your opening?
We did, that was one of the parameters. And, well, you know what, we didn't analyze that.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I think that would be, what would be your prediction on that?
Shorter relationship, quicker estrangement.
Probably true.
Higher rate of estrangement.
And then you could see, actually, now that I'm thinking about that, like if you estrange from someone that you've known for 30 years versus someone you've known for a month, that might say something about,
Right.
you know, loyalty or the nature of who you are as well, too. So that, you know, that would be really.
It would be the same comparison, like he was saying, like bigger social network, maybe higher number of estrangements.
Right.
Shorter relationships, higher number of estrangements, things like that.
I think so. Yeah, and it's funny because thinking one way that I introduced this, you know, there was someone was critical of this idea, but just to think about estrangements in a modern world, how many people have you blocked on Facebook? Like that might be just like, now it's not exactly an estrangement, and we didn't study it that way, but that would be an interesting thing, right? You know, and again, relative to your total social network on Facebook or you know whatever Snapchat or whatever the kids are using now. But that might be a really interesting, you know, quick variable that sort of gets at it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was kind of curious about sort of where you see some of this field going, especially when you have things like the lack of apology. One of the things I did in biological evolution, a lot of the questions really emerge from those things which we don't have good explanations for, become the focus of a lot of the research program. And I was kind of also thinking about the altruism versus the dark triad. A lot of what you were making arguments for was sort of this cooperation. How likely do you think we have sort of alternative tactics or alternative strategies that can help sort of understand the degree of variation that you're seeing the expression of these different types of socializing conditions or socializing characteristics?
It's a really important issue that you're raising, and I think, so there could be lots of sort of multiple strategies. I think like you're saying, like the dark triad seems to be a particular strategy, and that particular strategy seems to be, you know, estrangement's just fine, you know, and if you wrong me, I'm just going to get revenge on you, and that kind of thing. So I do feel like there could be like a different way of approaching it that's primarily about the plurality of strategies, which wasn't really the primary way that we're going at it. But I think that's a really interesting approach. You know, someone yesterday asked me, you mentioned the idea of the apology, and someone yesterday asked me to delve into that a little bit, and just to sort of get a sense of the evolutionary thinking about things like an apology or things like forgiving. There's a chapter by Robert Trivert in his 1985 Social Evolution book, an entire chapter dedicated to emotional and social implications of being a species high in reciprocal altruism. And so he kind of says that if you're in a species that the hallmark of your social behavior is that you live in a world where altruism, especially among non-kin, tends to be reciprocated, and we tend to count. And he even thinks that, has this prediction that math came about because we counted how many times this person had helped me or not helped me, this kind of thing. A lot of the emotions, such as like forgiveness, if you forgive someone, that's a signal of like, okay, I'm still keeping you in my social circle, right? You're still one of my 150. And if you apologize, it's kind of like saying, dude, let me back, you know, hold on to me in your 150. So a lot of those kinds of things seem to actually potentially have an evolutionary root. There's an example he gives in that book, because he started as an animal behavior guy, of chimpanzees. And chimpanzees have two different vocalizations that they bump into each other. One of them essentially means, yep, I meant to do that, get out of my way. And one of them kind of means, dude, I'm sorry, that was unintentional. You know, discernibly different vocalizations. So I think we can think of things like apologizing as having an evolution. Yeah.
So I guess I was thinking about each of the studies and the different variables that you chose, and I could imagine that, somebody who doesn't have an evolutionary focus, a psychologist, a positive psychologist, doing those studies, choosing the same variables. And I got bogged down in the studies themselves and sort of lost track a little bit of the overall perspective. What's different about the way you're viewing these results compared to the way a positive psychologist without an evolutionary focus
It's a
might?
value-added question. I think it's a very fair question. So the way that I see it, first off, a lot of these variables, like history strategy in particular, or triad in particular, initially came about from evolutionary research. So like life history strategy really comes from E.O. Wilson's idea about species differences and approaches going back to the 60s. And it's been sort of co-opted by evolutionary psychologists. And it's been, you can see here, it was a very effective variable. So I think, some of the variables themselves really owe to evolutionary reasoning. And, the way that we're thinking about it, when I'm sitting down with my students thinking about it, we're thinking about, okay, imagine these issues. Imagine a transgression on someone's person, or imagine someone with a high number of estrangements. Not now, but imagine that under those ancestral kinds of conditions, small-scale conditions. And it was really that conversation that led to the inclusion of the variables that we had in the design that we had. Could someone have designed the same thing without that? Possibly, but I say my team really used that as kind of the roadmap for how we progressed as we did. But I think it's a very fair question.
General methodological issue. The thing is, I'm uncertain to what extent the survey method used in experiment 2 is the best way to get at this sort of thing, because you're not even acting. Think about it. If someone directly insults me, you're activating my brain, you're activating my amygdala and my sympathetic response, you're activating a whole bunch of brain areas which are not being activated when I'm just sort of considering with my rational prefrontal cortex. Now, how would I feel if Victor would say something mean to me, as opposed to Victor saying, "You're a joke"? That's going to immediately trigger my low road, so to speak, to use a news term, and then I'm gonna. So I'm saying you're kind of activating the system a little differently with those two methods.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So this is for students of research methods. You probably learn about the trade-offs between internal validity and external validity. And I think a good follow-up to this would be to use ecologically valid, actors, or use an actual in-person kind of interaction, or video stimuli, or something where emotional and facial features and so forth are there. So I think you're absolutely right. The trade-off is, this was a very controlled experimental design, where we're able to make it the same for all participants, but we might be able to use some kind of more ecologically valid stimuli in an experimental design, and I think you're exactly right.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you so much.